They called him crazy. Out there, in the dark, under the whine of C-47 engines and the flak bursting overhead, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were laughing. Not the nervous kind of laughter that comes before a jump. No. This was different. They were laughing at him. Private First Class Hanley stood there, calm and quiet, clutching a flat piece of plywood roughly cut into a strange shape. Someone shouted over the roar of the engines, "Hey Hanley! You planning to surf the hedgerows?" The cabin erupted. Even the jump master cracked a grin. They said it was just plywood. He said it was all he needed. The night was June 5, 1944. Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy. Each man aboard the plane carried between 70 and 100 pounds of gear. Rifles, ammo, grenades, rations, even a few mines. But Hanley, a wiry young engineer from Ohio, had something no one else brought to the biggest invasion in history. A wooden board. When asked what it was for, he just smiled and said, "It's a trick for tanks." The other paratroopers rolled their eyes. Tanks? What tanks? They were the 101st Airborne, light infantry dropped behind enemy lines to seize roads and bridges. They didn't have bazookas. They didn't have artillery. If the Germans rolled in with armor, the best they could do was hide or pray. Hanley didn't laugh. He kept sanding the edge of his board, making it smoother. No one brings plywood to a tank fight. By dawn, the laughter had faded. The jump had scattered the 101st all across the French countryside. Hanley's platoon landed miles from their drop zone, near the hedgerows south of Saint-Mère-Église. Confusion. Gunfire. The sounds of war rising in the mist. The men regrouped under a hedgerow, checking weapons, whispering curses at the darkness. Someone spotted movement, German patrols already sweeping the area. The Americans crouched lower. They had only rifles and a handful of explosives. The road nearby was wide and hard-packed, perfect for tanks. One of the sergeants muttered, "We're not supposed to hold this spot. We move east." But then they heard it. A distant rumble. A mechanical growl rolling through the morning air. It wasn't trucks. It wasn't half-tracks. It was deeper. Slower. The sound of treads. A Panzer IV. The men froze. In training they'd been told to avoid armor. A single German tank could chew through a squad of paratroopers like paper. They had no bazooka, no mines left, and no hope of calling for help. Except Hanley. He reached into his pack, pulled out the strange piece of plywood, and began setting it up in the ditch. The others stared, whispering, "What the hell are you doing?" Hanley didn't answer. He drove 2 metal stakes into the ground, placed the board upright, and angled it slightly toward the road. The surface was smooth, covered in dull paint and mud, camouflaged, but reflective enough to catch a faint glint of light. He crouched behind it, checking the alignment like a carpenter proud of his work. The tank came closer, grinding, unstoppable. The commander's hatch was open. The barrel swung lazily across the field. The infantry huddled behind it, rifles ready. Then, just as the Panzer reached the bend, its engine roared and stopped. The driver had slammed the brakes. Through the haze, the tank's gunner shouted something. The Germans had spotted what they thought was a minefield marker, or perhaps the outline of an anti-tank weapon hidden in the ditch. They hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Hanley pulled the pin on his last M3 anti-tank mine, crawled forward, and slid it beneath the tank's belly. He barely made it back before the explosion tore through the hedgerow. The laughter that had followed him from the plane was gone. In that dark hedgerow, laughter turned to silence. When the smoke cleared, the men stared at the burning wreck. One tank, stopped by a man and a piece of plywood. Hanley didn't say a word. He picked up his scorched board, wiped the dirt off, and tucked it back into his pack. The sergeant finally asked, "What do you call that thing?" Hanley looked up and said, "Just a trick." Word spread fast. The story of the paratrooper who fooled a panzer with a piece of wood became legend among the scattered airborne units that week. Most thought it was a joke. Others whispered that maybe it wasn't. Because in war, sometimes the simplest ideas, born of desperation, made of nothing more than faith and plywood, could change everything. By the time the first paratroopers hit the ground in Normandy, one truth was painfully clear. They were light, fast, and hopelessly underarmed. The U.S. Army had built its airborne divisions on a radical idea. Men who could fall from the sky and fight behind enemy lines, far from supply routes and armor support. Every ounce of equipment mattered. Every bullet, every ration, Every tool had to be carried on a man's back or dropped in a crate that might never be found again. Inside those roaring C-47 transport planes, space was life. Each paratrooper carried close to 100 pounds already. Rifle, ammunition, grenades, food, water, and medical kits. Add the parachute harness, reserve chute, and jump gear, and there wasn't much left for anything else. A bazooka? Impossible. The M9 bazooka, America's main portable anti-tank weapon in 1944, weighed nearly 15 pounds for the launcher alone, and it came in 2 long tubes. The rockets were fragile, the wires delicate. Drop one from 1,000 feet and it wouldn't just fail, it might explode. The airborne planners knew it. So they stripped them out. As one veteran later said, you couldn't drop a bazooka from the sky and expect it to work. So the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed in France with almost no way to fight tanks. Their anti-armor options were limited to small satchel charges, a few anti-tank mines, and their courage. They weren't meant to stop tanks, just to slow them down, hold key roads, seize bridges, and wait for the heavy boys to arrive. But war doesn't follow plans. On June 6, scattered across the Norman countryside, American paratroopers found themselves face to face with German Panzer divisions. Not in theory but in the fields and hedgerows of reality. The tanks came earlier than expected, rolling through the narrow lanes that cut through the farmland. The airborne troopers, cut off and alone, had to make do with what they had, or what they could invent. And that's where men like Jack Nolan came in. Nolan wasn't born a soldier. He was born a maker. Back in Ohio, he'd worked as a carpenter, the kind of man who could build a table from scrap or repair a barn door with just a hammer and instinct. When the war came, the Army wanted men who could think as well as fight. The airborne recruiters called it initiative. Nolan called it common sense. They dropped him into the chaos of war and he brought with him what he knew best: his hands. American ingenuity had always thrived under pressure. From the barn workshops of the Midwest to the assembly lines of Detroit, the American worker had learned how to make things work with whatever was lying around. The phrase Yankee ingenuity wasn't just a slogan, it was a survival skill. During the war, that spirit became legend. Soldiers turned wrecked jeeps into makeshift ambulances. Mechanics turned scrap metal into gun mounts. Engineers fixed broken radios with chewing gum foil and spare wires. The battlefield became a giant, improvised workshop. When you have no tools, one corporal wrote home, you make tools. In Normandy, those tools might be as crude as a shovel sharpened into a blade, or a fuel can cut open to make a stove. But every improvised fix, every handmade solution, carried that same thread: the belief that problems could be solved somehow by will and imagination. Jack Nolan fit right into that world. He wasn't a hero in the storybook sense, not a medal winner, not a headline name. He was one of thousands of quiet craftsmen the war had drafted, men who understood that wood could be stronger than it looked, and that design could be deadlier than force. When his unit realized they had no way to stop German tanks, Nolan didn't curse or panic. He looked at what they had: scraps of parachute crates, broken crates of rations, bits of sheet metal, and, of course, wood. Lots of it. Normandy's hedgerows were lined with farm fences, barns, and abandoned carts. To Nolan, those weren't obstacles. They were raw materials. He began experimenting, carving, cutting, shaping boards by hand using his combat knife. He tested balance, reflection, and angle, all from the habit of a man who had spent years measuring twice and cutting once. His squad mates mocked him at first. "You building a boat?" they laughed. "Planning to row home?" But Nolan wasn't joking. He'd watched how German tanks responded to shapes, shadows, and markers. He'd learned that soldiers, even the best trained, could be fooled by what they expected to see. So he built something simple: a board shaped to mimic the outline of an anti-tank launcher, painted dull brown and mounted on short stakes. From the right distance, in the right light, it looked like a weapon, or worse, a minefield marker. It was an illusion, a piece of plywood theater in the middle of war. And in war, illusion could kill. Nolan's unit was part of the 101st Airborne's vast patchwork of drop zones scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. Their mission had been to cut off German reinforcements heading to the beaches. But by dawn on D-Day, the plan was a mess. Units were lost, radios destroyed, ammunition running low. So they improvised. Every barn became a workshop. Every soldier became an inventor. Some men filled bottles with fuel and cloth, turning them into Molotov cocktails. Others rigged mines from spare TNT and pressure fuses. Nolan kept working with wood, building props that could confuse, slow down, or redirect enemy armor. He didn't know it then, but what he was creating wasn't just a decoy, it was the birth of a method. A method so unorthodox that even his commanding officers thought it was a joke until it started working. Wood was what he knew, one survivor later said. War was what he learned. As the days passed, word spread across scattered platoons about the Carpenter from Ohio who built tricks for tanks. Some said he'd stopped a Panzer with a fake sign. Others claimed he'd lured German troops into an ambush with nothing but wooden planks. The stories grew with each retelling, part myth, part truth, but every man who heard them understood the meaning. Nolan represented something bigger. He was proof that even stripped of everything, heavy weapons, reinforcements, and certainty, American soldiers could still fight with their hands, their minds, and their nerve. The airborne men didn't have the tools they needed, so they built them. They didn't have the armor they wanted, so they created deception instead. That was the real weapon behind the Laughing Platoon. Not wood. Not mines. But the quiet genius of men who refused to accept what couldn't be done. He was the carpenter's son. Raised not on dreams of glory, but on the smell of sawdust and the rhythm of hammer on wood. In Depression-era Ohio there were no easy days. Factories slowed, fields went dry, and men worked with their hands just to stay proud. Nolan's father built barns, big, simple, honest structures that stood through storms because they were built right. No shortcuts. No wasted motion. Jack grew up in that rhythm. Every beam had a purpose. Every nail was a promise. He learned that strength wasn't about what something was made of, it was about how it held together when pressure came. They didn't talk about engineering in those days. They just called it good work. His mother kept the books, his father kept the tools, and Jack learned early that a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he could fix. When the nation fell into hardship, he found work through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, crafting benches, repairing barns, teaching himself the patience to see value in broken things. He wasn't rich. He wasn't loud. But he was steady, the kind of young man America built its backbone on. His father built barns, a friend once said. Jack built ideas. By 1942, when the army called, he didn't hesitate. The world had fallen apart, and men like him, men who knew how to build, were needed to put it back together. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the world changed. The heat, the noise, the constant drill, it all stripped away the quiet life of the carpenter and replaced it with something else. Jump school wasn't just about falling, it was about trusting. Trusting the silk above your head, the man beside you, and the calm inside your own mind. They told the recruits, "You don't fight gravity. You ride it down." That line stuck with him. The way gravity pulled a man toward Earth wasn't so different from the way life pulled a man toward his purpose. You couldn't resist it, you just had to shape it, guide it, make it land where it counted. Every jump was another lesson in control, not the control of muscle but of mind. He learned to pack his chute the same way he used to plane wood, with precision, patience, and respect for the tools. He learned to check, recheck, and then trust what he'd built. When other recruits cursed the long marches or the punishing drills, Nolan stayed quiet. He was observing, the same way he'd once studied the grain of oak, the balance of a beam. To him the army wasn't chaos. It was construction, a structure of men, purpose, and motion. At night, in the dim light of the barracks, he'd sketch things in his notebook. Patterns, ideas, little notes about leverage and angles. Some men drew pin-up girls. Jack drew hinges and handles. His bunkmates teased him, called him Professor. But when something broke, a buckle, a belt, a clasp, they came to him first. "Hey Nolan," they'd say, "you think you can fix this?" And he always could. Because for Jack, fixing things wasn't a chore. It was a kind of faith that anything built wrong could be built right again. By the time he shipped out to England with the 101st, Nolan had a reputation, not for bravery but for problem solving. If something jammed, he'd unjam it. If something cracked, he'd brace it. The quartermaster even joked that Nolan's kit looked like a toolbox disguised as a rucksack. He wasn't much for speeches, but the men respected him. He had that quiet kind of confidence that made others feel safer, like he could steady the world with his hands. And maybe that's what gave him the nerve to try something no one else would. It started as a sketch. A few lines on a scrap of notebook paper in the cold of an English winter. He'd been studying the Army's field mine manual, FM 5-31, the one that described the M3 anti-tank mine. It was a brutal piece of design. A steel disc packed with TNT, meant to explode under the crushing weight of a tank tread. But in practice the mines were hard to place. They needed perfect positioning, the right angle, the right surface contact. Jack read the manual, then frowned. He saw the problem not as a soldier but as a builder. The mine worked, but only if you could get it under the belly of the beast. And that, in a real battlefield, was almost impossible. The ground was uneven. The grass was thick. And the tanks, those rumbling monsters of iron, didn't stop to let you slide something underneath. Most soldiers just dropped the mine flat, hoped for the best, and ran. But Nolan didn't believe in hope for the best. "If I can hold it steady," he murmured, "I can break its belly." So he started sketching. A simple wooden brace, light enough to carry, shaped to cradle the mine at an angle. A wedge of plywood that would tilt the explosive upward, concentrating its force where the tank's armor was thinnest. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, a craftsman's fix to a soldier's problem. The others thought it was ridiculous. "You're gonna fight a panzer with a 2x4? One laughed. But Nolan wasn't joking. He refined the design, using salvaged boards from shipping crates. He sanded the edges smooth to prevent splinters that could snag on uniforms. He tested the balance, making sure it would stay steady even on soft soil. He called it the board. Nothing fancy, just the board. When the platoon saw it, they laughed again. But Jack didn't mind. He'd seen that kind of laughter before, men laughing because they didn't yet believe something simple could work. He'd seen it back in Ohio when his father built barns without blueprints. "Measure twice, cut once," his old man used to say. "And if it stands, it stands." Jack believed that. He didn't need approval. He just needed proof. And the proof would come soon, on a dark night in Normandy, when a German Panzer rumbled down a hedgerow road and the only thing standing between it and his unit was one carpenter, one piece of plywood, and an idea. That night would make him a legend, not for the wood itself but for the courage behind it. Because in that moment, when everything else failed, when the rifles were empty and the bazookas were still on some beach miles away, Private Jack Nolan would reach for what he knew best. His own hands, and build a solution from nothing. That's what made him different. That's what made him American. They heard it before they saw it. A low, rolling thunder beneath the soil, distant at first, then closer, shaking the ground under their boots. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a feeling deep in the chest, like the heartbeat of something mechanical and merciless. Tanks. For every airborne trooper in Normandy, that sound was the same nightmare in daylight. The Germans called them Panzerkampfwagen, machines built not for speed but for domination, iron beasts that chewed through hedgerows and men alike. The 101st had dropped light and fast, carrying carbines, rifles, and courage. But courage doesn't pierce armor. From their positions near the bocage lanes outside Saint-Cum-du-Mont, the men could hear them grinding closer. The Panzer IVs led the column, their treads clawing at the dirt roads, followed by the deep growl of a tiger, a monster whose very name carried weight. "You can't outflank a tiger in a hedgerow," one sergeant muttered, pressing his back against a stone wall. He was right. The terrain gave no room to maneuver. The hedgerows, tall and thick with roots and brush, turned the battlefield into a maze. Each field was a trap, and every trap was closing. The paratroopers' rifles might as well have been toys. Their grenades, when thrown against armor, did little more than scratch the paint. They were fighting machines designed to crush concrete, not men. To face a tank without anti-armor support was like standing bare-handed before a locomotive. The air filled with the metallic grind of treads and the steady cough of diesel exhaust. Branches cracked under the machine's advance. And still the men held their ground, praying for a miracle or a mistake. One squad tried the old trick, waiting for the tank to pass, then attacking from behind. They had one working bazooka, salvaged from a damaged crate. The rocket was bent, the wiring frayed. But it was all they had. They set up in the ditch, waited for the shadow to fall over them. The Panzer rolled closer, the ground trembling. The gunner took aim, heart pounding. He squeezed the trigger. A sharp hiss. Sparks. Then silence. The rocket didn't fire. "When sparks fly and nothing happens," one trooper said later, "fear rushes in." They scattered before the tank even noticed them. One man tripped over the roots, another lost his helmet. Behind them, the Tiger's turret turned slowly, hunting for shapes in the hedgerow. It didn't need to see, It just needed to fire. The blast tore through the air, shredding branches, flinging dirt like rain. The concussion alone was enough to drop men to their knees. 4 hours, the paratroopers moved through the hedgerows like ghosts, trying to avoid the armor they could not kill. Their radios were dead. Their supplies thin. Every new roar of engines meant another wave of terror. In those moments even the bravest felt small. They were men made of muscle and will, but the tanks were made of steel, fire, and endless motion. That night, huddled in the dark of a barn on the edge of the drop zone, the platoon argued. "What are we supposed to do, throw rocks at them?" one man shouted. "Maybe dig holes, hope they fall in," another said. Someone laughed, not out of humor but to keep from shaking. Jack Nolan sat in silence, his helmet resting on his knee. In the dim light of a flickering lamp, he traced lines on a scrap of plywood with his knife. He wasn't thinking about bravery. He was thinking about angles, pressure, balance, detonation. The squad leader, Sergeant McKinney, noticed. "What's that you're whittling, Nolan? A souvenir?" Nolan didn't look up. "Something to steady a mine." McKinney snorted. "You mean that board you've been dragging around since England? The boys say you're planning to build furniture." The men laughed. The kind of laugh that carried exhaustion and disbelief. Nolan smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe something that works better than a bent bazooka." They laughed harder this time. It was easier than hoping. To them, Nolan's idea was madness. A board of wood against tanks of iron. He'd already tested a crude version back in England. A simple frame that could hold a mine upright on uneven ground, angled toward an oncoming vehicle. It wasn't meant to be armor or even a weapon. It was a delivery system, a carpenter's solution to a soldier's problem. He called it the Nolan Board. They called it a joke. "What are you gonna do, hold it up and pray they drive into it?" one trooper asked. "Something like that," Nolan said quietly. He explained that the mine's detonator worked best under direct pressure, if the tank's tread struck the center plate just right. But the ground was rarely level, and the soft soil of Normandy made it even worse. The board, when staked into the dirt, would angle the mine perfectly. A tank would hit the edge, tip the mine upward and, in theory, detonate the charge beneath its hull. It was simple physics. Brutal, risky, but sound. The men shook their heads. "You're wasting your time." But Nolan didn't argue. He just kept shaping the wood, running his fingers along the edges, smoothing them as if it were a piece of furniture he intended to live with. He remembered his father once telling him, "The wood doesn't care what you build. It just waits for your hands to decide." That night his hands decided. In the next days the platoon moved between hedgerows, always listening for engines. Each encounter left them more desperate. Ammunition was low. The weather turned. Mud clung to boots like lead. And then, one morning as the mist lifted off the fields, they saw movement at the far end of a lane, the dark silhouette of armor again. A Panzer IV scouting, searching. The men ducked low. McKinney cursed. "Not again." Nolan looked down at the plank strapped to his pack. The laughter from nights before echoed in his head, but this time he wasn't thinking about what they said. He was thinking about what needed to be done. He pulled the board free, brushed off the dirt, and began setting it into the ground. "What the hell are you doing?" McKinney hissed. "Something stupid," Nolan said. He positioned the mine in the cradle he'd built, wedged it at an upward tilt, then crawled back toward the ditch. The tank's noise grew louder, the ground trembling. His heart beat slow and steady, the same rhythm as a saw on wood. The men watched, caught between disbelief and dread. And for a moment even the laughter died. War is a strange teacher. It mocks certainty, rewards chance, and remembers courage in the smallest gestures. Jack Nolan didn't invent a miracle weapon that night. He didn't stop a tank army. But he did something greater. He refused to accept helplessness. He looked at the world's most terrifying machine and thought there must be a way. That idea, the one everyone mocked, would soon be tested in the fire and chaos of battle. And before dawn, the platoon would discover that sometimes, the difference between survival and annihilation could be as thin as a board of plywood, shaped by the hands of a carpenter who believed in the impossible. The barn smelled of oil, mud, and wet hay. Outside, the Normandy rain fell in fine threads, hissing on the tin roof. Inside, under the dim glow of a single lantern, Jack Nolan worked like a man possessed. He had no blueprint. No workshop. No approval. Just scraps, A few boards from a broken crate, some nails pried out of a door frame, and a single mud-caked mine that someone had nearly stepped on the day before. The others watched in silence. Some out of curiosity, others because there was nothing else to do but wait for dawn. He didn't need orders, one trooper would say later. He needed a reason. That reason was survival. The paratroopers of the 101st had learned quickly that Normandy was not a place for heroes, it was a place for thinkers, for men who could turn desperation into design. And Nolan, the carpenter's son from Ohio, was built for that. He knelt on the dirt floor, sketching angles with a piece of charcoal. Every line was a thought, every stroke a possibility. He tested the wood's grain with his thumb, listening for the faint crackle that told him it would bend before it would break. The men gathered closer. "What's he making?" someone whispered. "Hell if I know," another replied. "Maybe a coffin just in case." They laughed softly, not mockery this time but a kind of uneasy respect. Nolan didn't look up. He was focused on the weight, the balance, the tilt. He'd seen what happened when mines detonated flat. Half the force lost to the soil, the explosion deflecting upward instead of into the armor's belly. If he could lift the charge just a few degrees, if the blast met the undercarriage at the right angle, the effect could double, maybe even triple. He didn't have textbooks or test equipment. He had instinct. By midnight the shape had formed. A crude frame, no bigger than a dinner tray, made of thin plywood and nailed in a triangle. The mine rested snugly inside it, angled just enough to face an oncoming tread. It wasn't pretty, but it was alive, the kind of ugly that might just work. He drove 2 stakes into the ground and set the frame between them, adjusting by the flicker of lantern light. When he was satisfied he sat back, breathing hard, sweat cutting through the grime on his face. One of the men, Private Jenkins, squinted at it. "So that's it? Your magic board?" "That's it," Nolan said quietly. "Looks like something my kid would build for a school project." "Maybe your kid's smarter than you think." Laughter again, this time warmer. In war laughter wasn't just noise. It was defiance. They named it the Nolan Board again, but the name no longer carried mockery. It carried curiosity. The next day Nolan tested his theory the only way he could, with a single unused mine, a chunk of soil and gravity. He placed the charge flat, pressed the primer, and triggered it with a controlled detonation fuse. The explosion was loud but shallow, the crater wide and soft. Then he reset it, this time using his angled frame. The same charge, same soil, same fuse. When it blew, the difference was immediate. The blast punched deeper, sharper. Dirt and debris flew nearly twice as high. To the naked eye, it was just another explosion. But to Nolan it was proof, the energy had direction now. It wasn't wasted, it was guided. He wiped the soot from his face, grinning faintly. "A flat charge dies on impact," he murmured. "A tilted one bites." That was the science of simplicity, not more power, just smarter power. He spent the next 2 nights refining the design, cutting boards scavenged from the ruins of a farmhouse. He learned that if the base was too thick, it buried itself. If too thin, it broke under pressure. He tested the angles using broken helmets and canteens, mapping how shrapnel traveled when the charge went off. His notebook, a small oil-stained field journal, filled with sketches, notes, and numbers. Most men at war wrote letters. Jack Nolan wrote equations. Word spread quickly through the company. A paratrooper had built his own anti-tank weapon, out of wood. By the time Captain Rourke heard about it, he was already irritated. Improvisation was one thing, explosives were another. He found Nolan by the hedgerow at dawn, testing the balance of another board. "What in God's name is this, Private?" "Something that might work, sir." Rourke crouched, inspecting the frame. "You're telling me this lumber contraption is going to stop a tank?" "With respect, sir," Nolan said, "it's not the board that stops it. It's what the board lets the mine do." The captain stood silent for a moment, staring at the makeshift rig. His instinct said no. His gut said maybe. War had a way of blurring the line between foolish and genius. "You've got 10 minutes before dawn," Rourke said finally. "Make it count." He turned to his men. "If he blows himself up, you bury him quick. We've got real work to do." But Nolan didn't blow himself up. Instead, he spent those 10 minutes setting the trap, measuring distance, checking fuse time, adjusting the tilt by feel. He worked with the precision of a craftsman, even under the gaze of skeptical officers. When he was done, he simply nodded. Ready? Rourke folded his arms. Let's see if your plywood can take on the Reich. It was June 10, 1944. The night was moonless, the air thick with fog and cordite. The fields near Carpenter were alive with distant fire, small arms pops, the heavy bark of MG-42s and the deep, rhythmic thump of armor. Nolan's squad waited in a drainage ditch along a narrow farm road. They'd placed 2 mines using his boards, hidden under a dusting of grass. 50 yards ahead, the road bent around a hedgerow, the perfect choke point. They could hear it again, the growl of engines. 2 tanks this time. Maybe 3. Every man felt the vibration crawl up his spine. Nolan's hands were steady. He checked the fuse one last time, then crouched low beside McKinney. You sure about this? The sergeant whispered. No, Nolan said. That's why it might work. The first Panzer appeared through the mist, its headlight faint behind a slotted visor. The treads clicked rhythmically, the weight pressing deep into the mud. 10 yards. Fuck. Then contact. The left tread struck the edge of the angled frame. For an instant nothing happened. Then the world split open. A blast tore through the hedgerow, lifting the tank's front end off the ground. The undercarriage flashed orange then black. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder that seemed to swallow the night itself. Debris rained down like ash. The tank's engine screamed, then went silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then McKinney's voice, hoarse and half-laughing, "Holy hell! It worked!" Another tank screeched to a halt behind the first, its crew disoriented. The paratroopers opened fire, seizing the moment. Bullets sparked off armor, but the message was clear. The ambush had teeth now. Rourke, watching from a nearby foxhole, stared in disbelief. "Would met steal," he said under his breath. And Steele lost. The men didn't cheer. They just stared at the wreckage, the rising smoke, and the shattered proof of what they'd just done. In that moment, the Nolan Board was no longer a joke. It was a weapon. A miracle born not from factories or laboratories, but from the stubborn mind of one soldier who refused to give up. When the sun rose, the field was quiet again. The burned-out shell of the Panzer still smoldered, its hull cracked open like a metal egg. The blast had ruptured the fuel line and torn through the driver's compartment. Rourke crouched beside the wreck, tapping the frame of the shattered board still wedged in the mud. "Write this down," he said to his adjutant. "Private Nolan's device. Improvised mine-angle frame. Effective." He paused, then smiled slightly. "Simple. American." The story spread faster than the smoke, from platoon to regiment, then division. Some called it luck, others called it genius. But everyone remembered one thing: it worked. 4 days afterward, men in nearby units scavenged wood, copying Nolan's design. They adjusted it, refined it, made it theirs. In a matter of weeks, it wasn't just his board anymore, it was their board. The 101st didn't win Normandy because of a piece of plywood. But in the chaos of those first days, that board represented something bigger. The idea that no problem was unsolvable, no odds truly absolute. In the hands of ordinary men, wood and wool became weapons. And for Jack Nolan, the carpenter's son from Ohio, it was the moment his 2 worlds finally met, the world of craft and the world of war. He hadn't built a weapon to kill. He'd built a reason to believe they could survive. The air still smelled of burned oil and black smoke when the second tank came. It was mid-morning now, pale sunlight breaking through the Normandy haze, glinting off the twisted wreck of the first Panzer. The paratroopers had barely had time to breathe, much less celebrate. Down the road, they heard it again. The low growl of gears, the crunch of treads chewing through wet soil. A counterattack. The Germans weren't retreating. They were angry. Nolan crouched by the ditch, mud streaked across his face, eyes sharp and alert. He could feel the vibration in his boots again, steady, deliberate. "They said lightning never strikes twice," Sergeant McKinney muttered. Nolan looked up, calm as ever. "Guess we'll find out." The squad had 2 mines left. One was already rigged with a board Nolan had built from the side of a cattle pen. The other, a backup, was still being armed by Jenkins, his hands trembling as he twisted the fuse. 5 minutes. McKinney barked. The men moved fast, every gesture deliberate, efficient. They knew what was coming this time. There was no panic, just a grim rhythm, the quiet professionalism of soldiers who had already seen death and decided to keep fighting anyway. The road curved just ahead, lined with hedges thick enough to hide their movement. They worked in the shadow, setting the board at a sharper angle this time, Nolan's instinct telling him the tank might come in slower, heavier. He hammered the last stake into the mud, wiped his brow and whispered, "Done." The sound was closer now, louder, heavier, the distinctive clank of armor links. Through the gaps in the hedgerow, they saw it. A Panzer IV, its commander scanning from the open hatch, unaware of the ambush waiting ahead. Behind it, the second tank followed, a mechanical twin dark with soot and rain. "Hold," McKinney hissed. The first tank rolled closer. 50 yards. 30. Every second stretched thin as wire. The men pressed themselves into the earth, barely breathing. Then contact. The tread struck the mine square. The explosion hit like thunder on the ground. A white-hot flash tore through the fog, lifting the tank's left side into the air. The turret spun uselessly as the hull tilted, the metal screaming under its own weight. The blast wave rippled through the hedgerows, flattening grass and shaking branches. 1 second. 2. Then the fuel line caught. Flames erupted through the back vents, black smoke rising like a signal to heaven. The second tank halted, too late to turn, too close to flee. Nolan shouted, "Now!" The squad opened fire. Rifle shots cracked across the field. Bullets pinged off armor, keeping the German crew inside. Someone tossed a phosphorus grenade. It burst against the side plate, white fire hissing like acid. The tank's engine coughed, then died. And for a moment, the only sound was the pop of burning oil and the ragged breath of men who couldn't believe what they'd just done. 2 tanks down. Not by artillery. Not by airstrike. By plywood. Captain Rourke arrived minutes later, still dusted with dirt from his own skirmish to the west. He froze at the sight. 2 smoking wrecks, one half buried in mud, the other burning slow and steady. McKinney met him halfway, a crooked grin on his face. "You told us to make it count, sir?" Rourke shook his head, half smiling, half stunned. "Christ almighty, you did." He looked toward Nolan, who stood quietly beside the ditch, holding what was left of his board, splintered, scorched, but unmistakable. Rourke approached, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You just changed how we fight out here, Private." Nolan said nothing. He just stared at the wreckage, eyes distant. He wasn't proud. He wasn't triumphant. He was just quiet. The battle faded as suddenly as it began. By afternoon, the gunfire had rolled west toward Carpenter. The fields lay still again, only the wind and the soft crackle of burning metal remained. Crows circled overhead, their calls sharp and distant. The platoon moved through the wrecks slowly, weapons raised, scanning for movement. Inside the first tank, the crew was gone, nothing left but shadows and smoke. The second was abandoned, its hatch open, tracks jammed. The smell was heavy, iron, oil, and something human that no one wanted to name. Jenkins kicked at the mud. "You think they'll believe this back home?" McKinney answered softly, "Doesn't matter if they do. We were here." They gathered what they could, weapons, rations, bits of equipment, and began digging shallow cover positions around the road. The war hadn't stopped just because 2 tanks had. Nolan sat by the hedgerow, staring at his hands. The skin on his palms was blistered and blackened, the fingertips raw from gripping stakes and wood. He didn't notice. When the echo died, he murmured, no one laughed. For the first time since D-Day, the laughter, the same one that had followed him from England to Normandy, was gone. In its place was something quieter. Respect. The men didn't tease him now. They simply nodded when they passed, a silent acknowledgement between survivors. That night, as the stars returned over the broken fields of France, Nolan opened his journal. His hands trembled slightly as he drew the last sketch, the final version of the board, the angle perfected, the stakes reinforced. He wrote one line beneath it. "If it stands, it fights." Then he closed the book, tucked it into his jacket, and leaned back against the tree. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. But closer still, in the dark around him, there was peace. A fragile, temporary kind of peace born from exhaustion and belief. The kind that only men who've survived the impossible ever understand. And in that silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through the hedgerows, the legend of the Nolan Board began to spread, not as a story of luck or invention, but as a reminder that even in the face of steel and fire, the human will to create could still outlast the will to destroy. It started as a whisper. One platoon talking to another. One sergeant passing a rumor through the static of a field radio. Somewhere between Saint-Cum-du-Mont and Carentan, the story of a paratrooper and his plywood contraption began to move faster than the wind. They started cutting every crate they could find. In barns, in trenches, in half-collapsed churches, men with knives and bayonets began prying apart wooden ammunition boxes. They stripped planks from supply pallets, sawed rough edges, and copied Nolan's design from memory. No blueprints. No diagrams. Just the simple, desperate logic of survival. One man swore he'd seen the board trick, stop a tank near Angoville. Another claimed it worked better when angled against a slope. None of them really knew where the idea came from, only that it had started with a carpenter from Ohio who refused to run. By the end of June 1944, entire squads were carrying makeshift wooden frames in their packs. Commanders didn't issue them, they just stopped asking questions when they saw them. And in the quiet corners of bivouacs, men began to talk about the board, the same way soldiers talk about Lucky Charms or saints or ghosts. A month later, during a debriefing outside Carentan, Captain Rourke tried to write it down properly. Under improvised anti-tank devices, he scribbled, use of wooden support frame to angle mine under tread. Field effective, reproducible. He didn't mention Nolan's name. There wasn't space and there wasn't protocol for it. But he knew. The report moved up the chain, passed from one desk to another, each officer adding a note or two, unorthodox. Creative. Repeat results pending. In the slow machinery of war bureaucracy, it might have ended there, another footnote lost in the flood of paperwork that followed every battle. But the field men kept it alive. A lieutenant in the 82nd tried it. Then an engineer unit. By autumn, the concept appeared in a small addendum to a training bulletin circulated to airborne divisions in England. Field innovation. Use of wooden bracing to stabilize anti-tank charges on uneven terrain. No signature. No credit. Just the idea. And that was enough. Recognition in war rarely comes with ceremony. Most of the time it comes with silence. There was no medal for Private Jack Nolan. No photograph in the papers. No citation from headquarters. Only results. Not every hero gets his name printed. Some get plywood. McKinney used to joke that if Nolan had built a bridge instead of a bomb, they'd have named it after him. But Nolan never wanted that. To him, the act of creating, of building something that worked, was the reward. He was a carpenter before he was a soldier. And when the war demanded destruction, he still found a way to build. When the unit pulled back to Cherbourg weeks later, Nolan was reassigned to a logistics section, repairing field crates and makeshift shelters. He didn't talk about what happened near Carentan. When men asked, he'd just shrug and say, "It wasn't me. It was the board." But those who were there remembered. They remembered the sound of that first blast. They remembered the way fear turned into awe. And they remembered how, after that day, nobody laughed at plywood again. By the time autumn rains swept across Normandy, the story had grown legs. Every retelling made it a little grander, a little more impossible. A legend shaped by campfire light and memory. Some said the board could stop a tiger with one blow. Others swore Nolan had built a dozen of them and lined the roads like a trapper setting snares. Maybe it didn't matter which version was true. What mattered was the lesson. That in the middle of chaos and steel, one man's idea, small, ordinary, made of wood, could shift the balance even for a moment. And in that moment the story stopped being about war. It became about America itself. A country built by hands that refused to quit, that looked at scarcity and saw opportunity, that believed a good idea was worth more than any weapon. When the men of the 101st sailed home months later, they brought souvenirs, helmets, maps, photos, fragments of their own courage. Nolan brought nothing. He left his board behind, buried somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy. But its shape, its purpose had already made it home. Long after the war, engineers studying battlefield reports would reference an unnamed field method that improved mine placement. They never traced it back to a single soldier. They couldn't. Because by then it wasn't one man's story anymore. It was everyone's. A shared memory of the moment when laughter turned to belief. When plywood became proof that American hands could still turn weakness into strength. When the 101st marched toward Bastogne that winter, they carried little more than what they could improvise. Ammo was low. Rations were thin. But the spirit, that relentless make-it-work spirit, had already taken root. Across the Ardennes, soldiers wired together spare radios with chewing gum and copper wire. In Italy, GIs used jerrycans to patch half-tracks and built makeshift flamethrowers from fuel pumps. In the Pacific, Marines welded scrap metal into armor plates for landing craft. Improvisation wasn't an act of desperation anymore. It had become a doctrine. Everywhere the war went, there were echoes of Nolan's idea, not the wooden board itself but what it represented, the belief that an ordinary man could change the battlefield with what he had on hand. The High Command called it field initiative. The soldiers called it survival. History would later call it innovation. When the war ended, the paperwork followed home first, crates of reports, blueprints, memos. Among them, tucked inside an engineering summary dated August 1945, was a quiet note from the Corps of Engineers. Observation: simplified mechanical aids produced by enlisted personnel proved tactically valuable. Encourage continued experimentation. That single line, no names, no stories, carried the DNA of every man who ever refused to wait for permission to solve a problem. And somewhere in Ohio, long after the factories had switched from tanks to tractors again, Jack Nolan returned to his father's workshop. The same smell of sawdust. The same worn tools. The same hands that once shaped boards for barns now carried the memory of a war fought with both wood and will. He never talked much about the invention. When asked, he'd just smile and say, "Sometimes the simplest thing saves the hardest day." Decades later, a young ordnance officer flipping through declassified World War II manuals would find the phrase "field constructed support frame" in an appendix. It was small, technical, unremarkable. But for those who knew, it was a quiet tribute. The Carpenter's idea had outlasted the war. And maybe that's how America remembers its heroes best, not through statues or songs but through habits. Through the way a mechanic refuses to quit until the engine hums again. Through the way a student rebuilds a broken radio instead of throwing it out. Through the way a nation still believes that a good idea, however small, however strange, can change the course of something bigger than itself. Because America wins wars with ideas, not just weapons. In the end, Jack Nolan's plywood board wasn't just a trick of physics. It was a symbol of the quiet genius that hides inside ordinary hands. It taught a lesson that outlived every tank it destroyed, that courage can build even when surrounded by ruin. That invention isn't born from comfort, but from necessity. And that somewhere between fear and faith lies the spark that moves a nation forward. The war moved on. The men grew older. But the legacy remained, written not in ink, but in the grain of every board, in the heart of every builder who believed that even the smallest idea can hold up the weight of the world. Somewhere in northern France, beyond the hedgerows that once echoed with gunfire, a farmer plowing after the war found a splintered piece of plywood half buried in the soil. It was stained by rust, darkened by rain, and still marked with the faint outline of a stenciled American serial number. He didn't know what it was, not really, but he could tell it had been made by hand. The edges were beveled with care, the grain sanded smooth where it didn't have to be. Whoever had built it, he thought, must have cared more about it than a soldier normally would about his tools. That piece of wood changed hands over the years, passed from the farmer to a local collector, from the collector to a small museum in St. Mary-Glise. There, it sits in a glass case today under the label. Improvised Mine Frame, Normandy, June 1944, unknown maker. Most visitors walk past without a second glance. To them, it's just another relic, something small, dull, ordinary. But for those who linger, there's something quietly profound about it. It doesn't look like victory. It doesn't shine or boast. Yet it speaks, softly, about the men who fought not with the best equipment, but with the best of themselves. They said it was just plywood. He said it was all he needed. And now, 80 years later, that single piece of wood still tells his story, not through words but through the silence of what it survived. When the war ended, the men of the 101st came home on slow ships and crowded trains. They stepped off onto platforms where banners hung and brass bands played, but their eyes looked past it all, toward the places waiting to be rebuilt. America in 1945 was a nation holding its breath. The factories that once made bullets now made washing machines. Steel plants turned to building bridges and cars. And the same hands that had fixed weapons in barns now built houses in new suburbs that stretched farther than the eye could see. Jack Nolan returned to Ohio, to a country that looked familiar but felt reborn. Under the GI Bill, he studied carpentry formally this time, not as a trade but as a craft. By the time the 1950s came, his small workshop had grown into a business. He built homes for other veterans. Simple, sturdy homes with porches and wide front doors. He said he liked the sound of hammers in the morning, because it reminded him that something was being made again, not destroyed. America had changed, but its heart hadn't. The same ingenuity that built a weapon out of plywood was now building the post-war world. One house, one bridge, one invention at a time. The men who once carried rifles now carried tool belts. The ones who dug trenches now laid foundations. The same grit, the same pride, just turned toward peace. And in that transformation, from soldier to builder, from fear to hope, lay the quiet miracle of what they had fought for. They came home to build again, houses, lives, and peace. In the twilight of his years, Jack would sometimes take his grandson to the edge of the woods behind their home. He'd point to a tree and say, "You see that grain? Nature never wastes a line. Every mark means something." The boy didn't understand then. But years later, when he visited Normandy and stood before that glass case, he finally did. Behind the faded wood and the word unknown, he saw his grandfather's hands, steady, patient, determined. And in that moment, the war felt close again, not as a memory of destruction, but as proof of what ordinary people can create when the world is falling apart. Because even when the sky was burning, a carpenter still found time to build.